Hello there. Today we're going to be taking a look at Act 1, Scene 5 of Romeo and Juliet in this video guide. It's a good idea to have a copy of the play to hand so you can take some notes. I make no apologies. This is going to be one of the slightly longer videos in this sequence, but that's because this is one of the most important scenes in the play with some of the most quotable lines, perhaps in the English language. Perhaps this particular scene in terms of this play is probably second only to Act 2, Scene 2, the famous balcony scene. But this is the party scene. This is an incredibly important scene because this is the first meeting of Romeo and Juliet. And if you think about that in terms of its importance in literary history, Romeo and Juliet is one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known play of Shakespeare's. And some of the lines that are delivered by Romeo and Juliet have made their way into English idioms, and they are just sayings. They are things that people know. They're part of the culture of the English language, regardless of where it's spoken. This is, some of the most impactful words in the English language exist for the first time in this scene. Again, I don't want to come off as too much of a Shakespeare geek. I think the fact that I'm literally going scene by scene and analysing every scene of Romeo and Juliet probably tips you off to the fact that that's pretty much me. But I can't emphasise how important this scene really is and how important some of these lines are. So without further ado, let's crack on. Otherwise, this is going to be one epic two-parter of a video, and let's try and get through. So this is, like I say, this is the first time when these eponymous lovers meet, although they don't know who the other one is until after they've parted ways. It's also the scene which sets up a key plot element for later on in the play, the confrontation between Romeo and Tybalt. The dramatic and tragic climax of the central part of the play occurs in Act 3, Scene 1, and this is because of this confrontation that doesn't occur here but is deferred till later on between Romeo and Tybalt. See, the dramatic conflict of the entire play is resolved in Act 5, Scene 3, at the very end sequence. But the key apex moment, the crisis moment, occurs as a result of something that happens in this scene. It's also contextually quite interesting because we see how power is played out within the family, and in particular here between Capulet and Tybalt, two males, both of them seeking the position of alpha male and butting horns like angry stags. There are lots of language and structural devices in this scene that are really important to pay attention to. We get, as you would expect with Shakespeare, the use of, as you would expect with Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, the use of antithesis, the use of oxymoron, the use of contrast, the use of light and dark. Things that, as I've said before in other videos, are absolutely central to the linguistic structures in this play. But we also see the use of verse form, which is really important. And again, we will delve into that in some depth momentarily. And what is really interesting is that Shakespeare breaks his own dramatic rules at this moment to drive the plot forward. In this scene, we see something happen that just by the rules of Shakespeare's own stagecraft shouldn't occur. And we'll look at that as we get to it. So here we go. It starts off with, as many of these incredibly dramatic sequences do, we have the lower order characters coming in, the serving characters, the characters that represent the ordinary folk coming in, and they make small talk and jokes, and there's a kind of lightening of the tone, both in terms of the linguistic elements, but in terms of the seriousness of the discourse as well. And here we have some people just joking away with each other, kind of like, I guess, below stairs banter occurring here. Note, they speak in prose, essentially. They don't rhyme. There's a very naturalistic feel to their language. And then we get Capulet welcoming people in. So this is a masked ball. So this is the device by which we're able to have uninvited guests arrive. Have we say uninvited guests? They were technically invited. Peter did say to Benvolio and Romeo, come along, although he did say, if you're not at the house of Montague. But also Mercutio is there with them. He's bringing them along, so it looks like he's trying to use his +1, as it were, to get them through the door. And Capulet plays the host here. There's some jokes going on here talking about, any lady who refuses to dance clearly has corns on her feet. And he's trying to just set the lightness and the humor of the tone and be the life and soul of the party, because that's his job as host. And again, he goes and says, in fact, quite a lot of directors have him saying this directly to the Montague boys as they are there in their masks. But I mean, he's just talking to guests, saying, "Oh, there was a time when I would have worn a mask and I could have told charming tales to woo the ladies." And he's again just engaging in this small talk with his guests, which feels naturalistic. And he sets to reminiscing with his cousin Capulet about how long ago it was since they last celebrated in this way. And most of you watching this video will not experience this, but certainly once you get to a certain stage of life, and I'm not saying that I'm there. Yeah, I am. But when time seems to pass incredibly quickly, you just go, "What wasn't that like last week?" And people go, "No, it was like 3 years ago." And here it's even more, because they're even suggesting it was like 30 years since they were last doing this. And this happens once you get to a certain age. The passing of time changes. You perceive things, because a year is, and I'm not going to give too much away about my own age, but a year is a significantly smaller chunk of my life than it is to, say, my little boy. It's a very big portion of his life. So that feels like a very, very long time. Whereas for me, it is a much smaller proportion. And again, this is what happens, and you miss the passing of time. And here you've got this discussion going on here. So you've got Shakespeare reflecting on experiences that are universal. And then, of course, we hear Romeo, and he spots Juliet for the first time. The servant, it's interesting, the servant doesn't know who she is. So he talks to the serving man, "Who is she?" Possible reasons for that. Servants not really seen Juliet. The Capulets have a lot of servants who would be at different parts of their properties, or possibly the servant is just working at this point, but he doesn't recognize Juliet, probably because Juliet hasn't made very many public appearances. She is, after all, only just about to turn 14. She has not been in the public eye very frequently. And again, it's just interesting, because there's a sort of sense in which this reinforces the idea that Capulet has been keeping his daughter close, keeping him to herself, trying to have that family life that he's not been able to have because of child mortality. And here we get Romeo deliver this line, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright." The powerful images of light. And then we get another one about she's like a rich jewel. She's beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. And I do find that line ironic. Her beauty is too much for the earth. She can't exist on this earth. She's too beautiful, which ultimately, of course, is her fate. She ceases fairly rapidly to exist on this earth. She doesn't make it to the end, to make it past the end of the play. Again, notice the images of light and dark here, the dove versus the crows. Interesting choice of birds. Obviously, they're dark in color, but crows are carrion birds as well. So maybe there's even a little bit of foreshadowing there, with the crow being a symbol of death. But more likely, it's that light and dark imagery where she is the bright thing. She is the light thing. And he refers to her in these terms repeatedly, or "Speak, bright angel," which occurs in Act 2, Scene 2. And again, notice the use of rhyming couplets here. He drops into full-blown verse rather than just blank verse with occasional rhymes or prose. Here we have him in full verse form. His lines are now delivered in couplets. There is not one set reason why Shakespeare will use verse form. So don't fall into the trap of going, oh, yeah, there's verse form. Clearly it means the character is in love. Well, no, that is not the case, because we see verse form in many different contexts. But what it does show is something, and you have to look at what that is in the context of what is occurring. And in the case of Romeo, is showing the really powerful emotions. Frequently, characters who are higher order will use this when they are in an emotive or contemplative mode. So when they're saying something important, it will be rhymed. It shows how Shakespeare is crafting the language to grab our attention. What's interesting here as well, though, is in place of the imagery that he's used when talking about Rosaline, which is very much focused on her looks, although he does say, forswear its sight. So again, he's saying that you can't believe his eyes. His imagery then becomes actually quite demure, quite maybe not self-deprecating, but it becomes very reverential. He said, make blessed my rude hand. I just want to touch her hand. That's all I want to do, touch hers. And make my hand blessed. So we can really see this kind of ramping up of the emotional tone of his language. And it's moving away from just, yes, he's still talking about beauty and looks. But in reality, there's something else occurring here. There is a change. He is reacting in a more emotional fashion, which, for Romeo is saying something, but an almost more genuinely emotional fashion than he has done when referring to Rosaline. And I think Shakespeare is really trying to make it clear that Romeo has fallen in love, that Juliet does fall in love. And again, there's evidence in a moment which we'll look at. Because if not, this is just two silly kids doing silly kid things. And actually, that's a way you could play it that way. You can look at it like that. That is, these two characters have met, they think they've fallen in love, and it's their immaturity and lack of, and their inability just to take it slow and think things through, their lack of experience that drives them to the fatal end that they reach. But I do think that's quite a harsh judgment upon these characters, because I think we are meant to believe that they're in love, and I will show you. There is, however, still this thing that he is fixated on physical beauty. He can't ignore it. It's love at first sight. Yeah, but then again, he's got nothing else to go on because he hasn't even spoken to her yet. And then this happens. This by his voice should be a Montague. Fetch me my rapier, boy. Dares the slave come hither covered with an antic face to fleer and scorn at our solemnity? Now, by the stock and honour of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin. So again, we've got rhyming couplets, powerful emotions, different kind of powerful emotion here. This, though, is significant. This by his voice. The convention of the soliloquy is well established. It's well established by Shakespeare himself. Romeo was talking his thoughts to the audience. They're not audible. They're not meant to be a thing that other people can hear. And Tybalt hears him. Fate is set against Romeo and Juliet. They're going to meet. They're going to fall in love. But this event leads directly to the deaths of these two characters, along with a whole bunch of other people. This event is part of a chain of coincidences which are set up deliberately by fate, in this case, in the guise of Shakespeare. The rules of the player against them, they cannot avoid their fate, which should be obvious because we've been told. But it's the power of Shakespeare's narrative that, we still gasp, we still react in shock when these things happen. But this is really, really interesting because he even goes to the extent of driving his plot forward by abandoning the dramatic rules that govern what's occurring on stage. Again, it's interesting to look, as I said, at the rhyming couplet, but then you also get these strike and sin, the sibilant sounds, that hissing, unpleasant note, stock as well in there. So there's lots of sibilances. And then you've got plosives, dead, strike. You've got that hard K sound, that D sound. These are lines that can be delivered with power. And note the opposition with honor as well, focusing on the idea that there is something that has been done which slights the family. He's intercepted by Capulet because we can't have the fight here. We can't have the fight now. We can't have this happen before Romeo and Juliet get together. Romeo is, in fact, in every version of the play I've ever seen, he's completely oblivious to the fact that Tybalt's, spotted him here. Capulet intercepts him, and again, we notice about that idea of he's assuming that Romeo has come here deliberately to cause trouble, to scorn them, to in some way show an insult. So again, it shows Tybalt taking this as a slight to his honour. Again, we can contextualize that. This is how Tybalt would have been brought up. This is how young men would have been behaved. There are several examples here as well of how Tybalt views the world. He uses the word villain. I mean, there's a couple of things. Firstly, Tybalt is unaware of his own status as the villain, or maybe he's very conscious of his own status. Think about how that line could be delivered. It could be delivered in a knowing way to the audience, where Tybalt is recognizing, I know I'm the villain. But there's the irony that he uses it, and in reality, he is the villain. There's also something else going on here. Villain is a shorthand for villain, which is a variant of peasant. Tybalt also calls him a slave, another insult that is based on social status. So you can see here Tybalt's obsession with social status coming through in the language that he uses. And Capulet, of course, says, "Content, ye gentle cousin." You've got the irony of him calling him gentle, but of course this is the use of language by a character trying to calm someone down. So he's using very gentle language. It's really perceptive. This is how you would talk somebody down. You would use this very gentle, lulling language to bring someone else's temperament down. And he bears him like a portly gentleman. Just do pay attention. The word portly there doesn't mean that he's going, oh, he's a bit fat. Don't fight him. No, it means portly just means that he's got good character. He is a respectable looking gentleman. And he's virtuous, well governed. His reputation is good. Everyone speaks highly of Romeo. Obviously, they've not spent time around him recently because all he seems to do is cry under trees, but hey ho. Anyway, he has a good reputation. He's well known. And we get Capulet saying, look, don't mess with him. All right? Be patient. Giving him really strong advice. But then he switches. It is my will, which if thou respects, and suddenly we see what's happening here. I want this to happen. If you respect my authority, you will follow. A point, incidentally, which Tybalt clearly misses because he repeats the villain, and he goes to, I'll not endure him. So look at these, and you can see these pronouns occurring in the next section as well. I'll not endure him. This is all about Tybalt's wants and desires and thoughts and needs, and how he feels he has to respond. This does not go down well, not at all. And we see it in the language. What good man? Boy. That word boy. I'm going to demonstrate to you where you are. You are a boy. Because he said, you'll be the man. He's saying that and basically saying, no, you will not be. You are the boy. I am the man here. So we see Tybalt being reminded of his place, his relative status here. And again, you'll not endure him. You'll do that. The pronouns, I say, Shan, you won't do this. So there's this very much first and second person pronoun. He's clearly saying, you're going to do this. No, you will not. I say this is what will happen. And again, these pronouns show that here is Capulet reasserting his authority. The Tybalt just isn't clever enough to shut up. He carries on, and why Uncle 'tis a shame, but this is interesting because he shows his true colours here. This is Tybalt who is worried about the status and what will happen if people realise that a Montague has snuck in here, and what will this... He believes that this dishonour is something that cannot be let go. Capulet, of course, having a more of a mind to how the heck would the prince view this, and actually I don't really need... And it is interesting that Capulet doesn't react with enmity towards Romeo. In fact, it clearly shows there's no basis for the feud. There's no reason for it because Capulet quite likes Romeo. It is just the name, a point that comes back in later acts and scenes. This line, you are a saucy boy. boy again is the word to focus on here. Saucy has acquired much less serious meanings when used as an insult in modern terms. In fact, it's not even an insulting term, really. But they're quite powerful language. Again, the use of the word boy. And this line, this trick may chance to scathe you. This, this attitude, this way of behaving may well get you, come back to bite you. You may well be hurt through this. And it literally does. Act 3, Scene 1, you will find that this is quite literally the truth. This trick, this behavior does scathe Tybalt. And what we see here is that Capulet is trying to maintain peace here, but at the same time talk to his guests. And you see that you've got lines that bounce between directly, probably hissing in Tybalt's ear, and speaking directly to the guests. So at the end of this, though, we get this line, which is really important, because Tybalt delivers a soliloquy of his own, which is, in this instance, not heard by Capulet. So the rules of the soliloquy are back. And he says this combination of forced patience and my own desire for anger and making me tremble, and I'll withdraw now, but this is going to come back. And it's interesting, he points about willful choler. He recognized that his actions are ungoverned and impulsive. Is it self-awareness? Is it just an awareness that's directed at the audience? And of course, these lines are, of course, prophetic, because it does convert to bitterest gall. It does become something that is the source of the tragedy, the bitter gall that everyone is forced to swallow at the end of the play. The unpleasant image I've just conjured there. And then the next thing is Romeo approaches Juliet and delivers these lines. And these lines are extraordinary. And if we didn't believe that it could be love at first sight, then look at this. These lines, these first 14 lines, form a perfect Shakespearean sonnet. If you don't believe me, do it yourself. Do the A-B rhyme scheme. Look for the 14. So we have, here we have it. There's a quatrain. There's a quatrain. 1 and 3, 2 and 4. 1, much touch, this kiss. Oh yeah. And then they share it. They actually share the sections of the third quatrain. And they share the couplet. Romeo and Juliet have this synergy in their lines. They drop into this rhyme scheme, which can't happen by accident. Shakespeare is telling us this is fate. They are in love. You have to believe it. Their first lines are a love poem. And what's interesting to note is Romeo's language. It follows this courtly love tradition. He is devotional towards her. He looks at her as something holy, as something divine. It might be hyperbole. It might just be kind of his best chat-up line, but I'm not convinced by that. I really do think we are meant to believe. We have to believe that they're in love. And what's interesting is that Juliet smoothly locks into this. Of course, she smoothly locks into it. Shakespeare's writing this. We know that. We know that behind this, Shakespeare has written this. But what he's doing by showing her picking up the same metaphor and running with it is that she's following the same mindset that Romeo is. Not just the same mindset, but dare I say it, the same heart set. Yes, I know that's a corny phrase I've just coined, but that's where they are. Their hearts are one, just as their lines are one. And eventually they kiss. You kiss by the book. It's interesting. She's impressed, almost as if, Romeo, this is what a kiss should be like, what she would have heard about in stories or read about in books, or that Romeo must have learned this from a kissing manual. Of course, she has no point of reference either. The chances are that she has never been kissed romantically prior to this point. She'd barely been recognized by people who work in her own house. And then she's taken, she's pulled in another direction, and the party begins to end, and the characters go off in their own different directions, and the nurse takes Juliet to one side. And we get to the point where they have clearly fallen in love, but they still don't know who the other person is. And Romeo asks directly, and the nurse tells him, and he even can't resist talking about, oh yeah, whoever gets with her is going to be well off. Talks about the idea of the chinking of the gold coins, referring to the kind of political and financial ramifications of a union with Juliet. Of marrying Juliet, you become the inheritor of the Capulet wealth, reminding the audience that there's actually more at stake here than just the relationship between these two young people, kind of just reinforcing their status and the consequences of that. And here we get Benvolio kicking in and Romeo providing a rhymed line, again, the use of verse form. And everybody leaves, and the Capulet sees them off, and we're left with just Juliet and the nurse on stage, and Juliet's trying to get out of the nurse who the people are as they're leaving through the door, and she has to go off and find out who Romeo is. And we get this line, go ask him his name if he be married. My grave is like to be my wedding bed. Shakespeare is doing this again. He is hammering home to us again. This is how the play ends. This literally will come true. She is going to be in a grave, which is likely to be her wedding bed. It's not quite in the circumstances you might imagine. Spoilers, she does die. Obviously, we all know, but I'm not going to explain the exact circumstances in case you're watching this in sequence at the same time as watching the play and you don't know how it ends. I'm not sure how you would not know how it ends, but still, maybe there are people who don't. But we do know that this is literally what happens. What should have been a wedding ends up being a funeral. And we're being reminded again and again and again throughout the play. But the subtlety of Shakespeare's lines, that just he throws this poetry here at us, and we kind of only notice it in hindsight, in retrospect. What's interesting here is to find out Romeo and Montague, the only son of your great enemy, and what is intriguing is the nurse just accepts it. Your great enemy, yeah, of course, he's the Montague's the enemy. She has there's no explanation being offered up. She's just clearly just interpolated the fact that the Montagues are enemies. Nobody knows why. Nobody gives a history. We even find out nobody understands. Bred of an ancient word by the it says the bred of an airy word, sorry, by the old Capulet, and the Montague says the prince in Act 1, Scene 1. It's just this has come out of just a word that's been said. We don't know where it's come from. The ancient grudge is just a thing that seems to have been inherited. And there's nothing inherently different or unusual or unpleasant about Romeo that should make him an enemy. In fact, we've already seen that Capulet quite likes him. It's maybe this is the point that Shakespeare is making, that this is a learned hatred and there's no real need for it. Again, look at Juliet's lines. My only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen unknown, unknown too late. I mean, what a beautiful rhythm there is to those lines. What a beautiful symmetry of the antithesis, the oxymorons being deployed, the contrast, love, hate, early, late, known, unknown, but then put together in this perfectly balanced verse form. It's such a powerful emotion. I mean, these lines are just fantastic, and they really do sum up the situation that they're in. And she says that I must love a loathed enemy. She says it out loud. She's in love with him. How? They have shared a total of what? 18 lines? I can't remember exactly how many. They've got a sonnet and then a couple more lines before they're pulled in two different directions by other people. But they're already in love. Because it's fate. And then the scene ends with Juliet contemplating how things are going to go. So this is that all-important first meeting of Romeo and Juliet, a scene probably eclipsed only by the famous balcony scene, Act 2, Scene 2. I personally think it's actually slightly more important, and the language is even more powerful because of that use of the 14-line sonnet, but that's just my opinion. Equally important, of course, in this scene is the spotting of Romeo by Tybalt. As I mentioned at the top of the video, this is hugely important because we get a broken dramatic convention, and this is a plot device that will drive the plot along, specifically at the crisis moment of the tragedy in Act 3, Scene 1. And Romeo and Juliet realize who the other one is, but by that point it's too late. They've already fallen in love. after a mere handful of lines. This scene is setting up that central relationship. It works in that plot device and shows how Shakespeare even sets dramatic conventions against our characters. And we are forcibly reminded of that fate of the star-crossed lovers through that foreshadowing, through that language of Juliet's, "My grave is like to be my wedding bed." So, there we have it. Act 1, Scene 5. Apologies for the length of this video, but there is a lot of stuff going on there in what is perhaps one of the most important scenes in the play. I hope you find this useful. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.